What would you do if the only thing left to your name was a mountain of rusted iron that everyone in the valley swore was worthless? A dead engine half swallowed by red rock, bought for the price of $3, and a signature no one thought was worth the ink. What would you do if the men who had taken your father's water, your father's land, and your father's good name stood on the canyon rim and laughed while you signed for a relic they were glad to be rid of? For 11 years a broken locomotive had lain wedged in the throat of a slot canyon in the high desert of the Arizona Territory, tilted on its side against a wall of orange sandstone, its boiler cold, its wheels sunk to the hubs in drift sand, its cab door chained and rusted shut. The whole town had walked the rim above it and never once climbed down to ask why a full steam engine had come to rest in a canyon no rail line had ever reached. They called it a monument to a fool's dream. They called it scrap. And when a young woman with nothing left signed her name for it, they called her a fool too. But sealed inside that cab, behind a door no one had opened since the day the engine died, was something that would take back every acre, every drop of water, and every kind word the valley had ever stolen from her family. This is the story of how she climbed down into that canyon alone, and of what she found waiting in the dark. Her name was Adeline Corliss, and in the autumn of 1887 she was 22 years old, and by every measure the town of Ruddock Wells kept, she was finished. Her father had been dead for 9 weeks. The fever had taken him in 4 days, so fast that she had not finished writing the letter meant to tell her aunt back east that he was even ill before the letter had to be changed to say that he was gone. She had buried him herself, with the help of the old Mexican man who dug graves at the mission and asked for nothing. And she had come home to the small adobe house on the edge of the Corliss claim to find that home was no longer hers. The paper the banker showed her was clean and new, and it said that her father, Thomas Corliss, had signed over the water rights on Coldwater Draw to the Halloran Cattle Company 3 days before the fever took him. Adeline knew her father's hand as surely as she knew her own breathing, and the signature at the foot of that paper was not how he made his letters. The T leaned the wrong direction. The tail on the final S curled up where her father's had always fallen away flat. She said so, quietly, standing in the front room of the bank with her hat in her 2 hands. And the banker looked at her with a pity so thin it was almost cruelty, and told her that grief made people see what they wished to see. "A dying man's hand shakes," he said. "That is all this is. I am sorry for your loss, but the company holds the deed to the water now, and without the water the land is worth nothing. You cannot run cattle on rock and sky." Everett Halloran was the man who held that new paper, and he had wanted the Corliss water for 6 years. Coldwater Draw held the only spring on the north end of the valley that ran clear through August, a thin thread of cold water that welled from the sandstone and never failed, and whoever held it held the whole northern range. Thomas Corliss had refused to sell it 12 times. He had refused it to Halloran's face in the street, refused it in front of witnesses, and told the man that the spring had been promised to no one but the land itself, and now, 9 weeks after his death, the spring belonged to Halloran, and the daughter belonged to nobody. She might have fought it. She had thought, in the first raw days, about the territorial court in the county seat, about a lawyer, about the witnesses who had heard her father swear he would never sell. But a lawyer wanted money she did not have. The county seat was 2 days' ride, and the one man who might have testified for her, an old ranch hand named Pell, who had worked the Corliss claim since before Adeline was born, had left the valley the week her father died with a new saddle and a horse he had not owned before. She understood what that meant. She was 22, she had $11 folded into the toe of a stocking, and she had no one. What she did have, when the bank and the company were finished carving up her father's life, was one strange and useless thing. In the settling of the estate, when the good land and the water and the house itself had all been claimed, the county clerk had found a single deed still in Thomas Corliss's name that no one at the Halloran Cattle Company wanted. It was for a parcel of canyon bottom on the far southern edge of the claim, a dry twist of Slot Canyon called Iron Wash, and it was worth nothing because nothing could be done with it. It grew no grass, it held no water, it was too narrow and too deep to run stock into, and its only feature, the only thing that made anyone remember it at all, was the dead locomotive that had lain rusting down in its depths for as long as anyone in Ruddock Wells could recall. The clerk, a decent enough man named Alonzo Speck, who did not like what the company had done, but had not the spine to say so out loud, called her into the record office and slid the deed across the counter to her with an apology already on his face. "There is this," he said. "It is the single thing they did not take, because it is the one thing not a soul would pay $1 for. Your father held title to Iron Wash and to whatever sits in it. Legally, that includes the old engine. I can transfer it to your name for the recording fee. $3. Adeline looked at the deed for a long moment. $3 was more than a quarter of everything she had in the world. $3 for a canyon nobody wants and a dead train nobody can move, she said. For the paper, Speck said, gently, the train is thrown in. Nobody has ever wanted it. Miss Corliss, I will be honest with you. This is not a kindness anyone would envy. But it is yours by right, and if you do not take it, it reverts to the county and then, likely enough, to the company. And I would rather it did not." He lowered his voice, though the office was empty. "Your father was a better man than the ones who are dividing him up. Take the paper, own the very thing they laughed at. Sometimes that is worth more than it looks." She could not entirely say why she agreed. Perhaps it was only that she could not bear to let the company have the last scrap of her father when they had taken all the rest. She counted out $3 silver from the stocking, and Alonzo Speck wrote her name into the record book in a careful clerk's hand, and Adeline Corliss walked out of the record office of Ruddock Wells, the owner of a bone-dry canyon and a rusted-out locomotive that had not moved in 11 years. The men on the boardwalk outside had already heard. News moved through Ruddock Wells faster than the wind. One of Halloran's riders, a broad man in a dark duster named Sim Doyle, who did most of the company's rough work, was leaning against a post with his thumbs in his belt, and when Adeline came out, he tipped his hat to her with a grin that had no warmth in it at all. "Heard you're a woman of property now, Miss Corliss," he said. Loud enough for the 3 men beside him to hear. "Heard you bought yourself a whole railroad. Where's your track run to?" The men laughed. Adeline stopped, and she looked at Sim Doyle for a moment, and something in her steadied that had been shaking for 9 weeks. "It doesn't run anywhere," she said. "It stopped. Same as your manners." She walked on before the laughter could turn, but she heard Doyle call after her, easy and mocking, "You go on and live in your train, then plenty of room. Nobody'll ever bother you down in that hole." She did not answer. But that night, in the borrowed back room of the mission, where the old grave-digger's wife had let her sleep, Adeline lay awake and turned one question over and over in the dark. The way you turn a stone to see what lives under it. Nobody would ever bother her down in that hole. She thought about that. She thought about a full-steam locomotive, a machine that weighed as much as a house, that had somehow come to rest deep in a slot canyon that no railroad had ever come within 40 miles of. She had grown up in that valley, and she had never once, not in 22 years, thought to ask the question that now would not leave her alone. How did it get down there? The question stayed with her through 3 days of not knowing what else to do. She did small work for the mission to earn her keep, mending, hauling water, sitting with an old woman who was dying slow, and in the spaces between she found herself walking to the south rim of the valley in the evenings and standing along the lip of Iron Wash, looking down. From the top you could just make out the shape of it, far below, a long dark bulk lying against the western wall of the canyon where the sandstone glowed orange in the last light. The boiler and the cab lay tilted on their side, half drifted with sand, and the great iron wheels stood free of the drift on the high side, 6 of them on a side, taller than a tall man. The spokes filled in with red dust. It looked less like a machine than like the skeleton of some enormous animal that had crawled into the canyon to die. The old prospector found her there on the 3rd evening. His name was Cletus Barrow, and he was easily 70, white-bearded and bent, with a battered flat hat and eyes gone pale as creek ice. And he had prospected the canyons around Ruddock Wells for 40 years without ever quite finding the thing he was always about to find. He came up beside her at the rim, quiet for a big man, and looked down at the engine with her for a while before he spoke. "You'll be the Corliss girl," he said, "the one that bought old Iron Wash off the county." "I am. Folks are having a fine time with that up in town." He said it without malice. "They think you got cheated for $3. They think you're touched with grief and don't know a worthless thing when you signed for it." He tilted his head at her, those pale eyes patient. "But you're not up here laughing at it. You're up here looking at it, same as I've been doing for 11 years. So I'll ask you the thing nobody in that town has ever bothered to ask. Do you know how it got down there?" "No," she said. "I've been trying to work it out. There's no rail down there. There never was. No line ever came within a day's ride of that canyon." "No," Cletus agreed. "There wasn't, and there didn't. And a locomotive don't walk. It don't fly. It don't lower itself down a 200-foot canyon wall on good wishes." He spat, thoughtfully, over the edge. "I'll tell you what I know, which is more than most and less than all. That engine arrived at Iron Wash in the spring of 1876, before you were hardly big enough to remember, on the back of the biggest fool's errand this valley ever saw. A company out of the East, the Sandoval and Territorial, run by men with more money than sense, got it into their heads to build a spur line clean through the canyon country to reach a copper strike that turned out to be mostly rumor. They hauled that engine and a string of cars overland by ox team, 40 mules and I don't know how many oxen, meaning to lay track up the wash and out the far side. And the flood came. Adeline turned to look at him, a flood. In the desert. The worst kind there is, Cletus said. A slot canyon in a summer storm is a killing thing. Water comes down 40 miles of dry country all at once, a wall of it, no warning, in a canyon so narrow there's nowhere to climb. That storm caught the whole outfit in the bottom of Iron Wash. Drowned the mules, drowned some men, they say, though the company never would put a number to it. and it picked up that locomotive like it was a toy and drove it down the wash and pinned it hard against the western rock where it sits to this day. The company was ruined. The copper was a lie. The survivors walked out and never came back, and that whole railroad company folded inside a year. And the engine's been down there rusting ever since, and this whole valley has told the story the same lazy way for 11 years. He leaned on his stick. A fool's dream, they say. Scrap iron, they say. And not one of them has ever climbed down to look. Because here's the thing they don't say, girl, on account of they never thought hard enough to wonder it. He turned and looked at her full on. If the flood drowned the crew and ruined the company and the survivors walked out with nothing, then who chained that cab door shut? And why is it still chained today? Adeline felt the small hairs rise on her arms in the cooling evening. She had seen it herself in the failing light, though she had not let herself understand it. The cab door was shut, and across it, plain even from the rim, ran the dark line of a heavy chain. "You've seen it," she said slowly. "The chain." "I've seen it. 11 years I've seen it. A door don't chain itself in a flood. A flood tears doors off. Somebody stood in that canyon after the water went down and put a chain on that cab and locked it, and then that somebody went away and never came back or never could." He nodded, slow, as if agreeing with a long argument he'd had with himself. "There is something in that cab worth chaining, Miss Corliss. Been worth chaining a good 11 years. And now, for $3, it's yours. Ain't that a thing? And here, if you have come this far into the canyon with her, is where I will ask you to do one small thing, because a story like this deserves to be finished with company. If you are the sort who has ever stood at the edge of something everyone told you was worthless and felt, somewhere under your ribs, that they were wrong, then take a moment now to subscribe and tell us down in the comments where in this wide country you are listening from tonight. Adeline had one old man who believed her and a whole town that did not. She could have used a few more at her back. Stay with her, because what she was about to climb down and find in the dark of that cab is the reason this valley has told the story wrong for 11 years. The next morning, before the sun was full over the eastern rim, Adeline Corliss went down into Iron Wash. She did not go unprepared. She had spent the last of her care, if not her money, gathering what she thought she would need. From the mission she borrowed a coil of good hemp rope, 40 feet of it, and a battered tin lantern and a can of oil. From the general store, on credit she was not sure she could ever pay, she bought a heavy pry bar and a hand file and a small hatchet, and she asked no one why a woman was buying tools to break into her own property. She wore her father's old canvas trousers under her skirt for the climb, and slung over one shoulder and across her chest she carried the worn tan leather satchel that had been her mother's and then hers, the one thing she still owned that had known her whole life. Into it went the tools, the oil, a canteen, a heel of bread, and folded flat against the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth. The forged deed the bank had shown her, the one with her father's name, made wrong. She hardly knew why she carried that. She only knew she could not leave it behind. Cletus Barrow met her at the rim, as she had known somehow he would, and he showed her the one place a person could get down, a fault in the sandstone on the eastern side where the wall broke into a rough stair of ledges. He was too old and too stiff to make the climb himself, and they both knew it, and neither of them said it. "I'll be right here," he told her, "all day if it takes all day. You get in trouble down there, you sing out, and I'll go for roping men, though God knows which men I trust." He caught her arm as she turned to the edge. His grip was surprisingly strong. "One thing, you watch that sky. You hear thunder anywhere, anywhere at all, even a rumble a county away, you climb. You don't finish what you're doing, you don't gather your things, you climb, and you climb fast and high. That canyon killed a whole outfit once. It don't care whose daughter you are, I'll watch the sky," she promised, and she went over the edge. The descent took her the better part of an hour. The ledges were narrow, and the rock crumbled under her boots, and twice she had to lower the satchel ahead of her on the rope and follow it down a face too steep to climb with it swinging. But she was young, and she was strong from a life of hard work, and she had climbed the canyon walls of that country since she was a child, and slowly. Ledge by ledge, the rim rose above her, and the great orange walls closed in around her, and the cool blue morning shadow of the deep canyon swallowed her whole. By the time her boots touched the sandy floor of ironwash, her hands were raw and her heart was going hard. But she was down, and she was standing at last in the bottom of her own canyon, and the dead locomotive lay before her. Close enough to touch, enormous, silent, and far, far bigger than it had ever looked from the rim. For a long while she only stood and looked at it, and a wave of something close to bitter disappointment moved through her, because up close the thing was plainly a ruin and nothing more. 11 years of drift sand had banked up along its lower side like a dune. The iron was scaled and flaking with rust the color of dried blood, and where the sun found it through a gap in the high walls it did not gleam. It only glowed dull and tired. The great wheels she had thought so grand from above were half buried and going to nothing. A steam whistle, brass once, was now a green nub. This was what she had bought. This was her whole inheritance. A dead machine rotting in a ditch, and for one sick moment she felt every bit the fool the town had named her. And she thought of Sim Doyle's easy laugh, and the banker's thin pity, and her father's name curled wrong on a stolen deed, and she was very close to sitting down in the sand and weeping. But she did not. She had come down for a reason, and the reason was the chain. She made her way along the length of the engine, one hand trailing on the cold iron, around toward the cab. The cab was the little iron house at the rear of the locomotive where the engineer had once stood, and it had come to rest tilted toward the sky, so that its door, the door she had seen chained from the rim, now faced half upward, awkward to reach. She had to climb the sloped flank of the tender, the coal car behind, to come at it, hauling herself up the rusted rungs of a ladder that groaned but held. And there, at the top, she found the door, and she found the chain, and she found that Cletus Barrow had been exactly right. It was no accident of the flood. The chain was wrapped 3 times around the door handle and through an iron bracket set into the frame, and it was closed with a heavy padlock, a good lock, a lock that a man had bought and carried down into this canyon and used with purpose. The rust had welded it half shut, but under the rust it was plainly a made thing, a decision, a lock put on a door by a human hand. Somebody had climbed up here after the water fell, exactly as she was doing now, and sealed this cab and gone away and never come back. "Somebody wanted you kept," she said aloud to the door, and her voice sounded strange and small in the vast quiet of the canyon. "Somebody wanted you kept for 11 years. She took the file to the lock first, and when the file only skated over the rust, she took the pry bar to the bracket, working it into the gap behind the iron plate throwing her whole weight against it. The bracket had rusted deep into the wood behind it, and the wood, she found as she worked, was not the soft rot she had expected, but hard, resigned mountain pine that the dry desert had cured near to iron itself. It fought her. She worked at it for the better part of an hour until her hands bled and the sun had climbed high enough to pour straight down into the slot and warm the sand below. And still the bracket held. She stopped, breathing hard, and made herself think instead of strain. Her father had taught her that. A thing that will not move by force, he used to say, is asking you to be cleverer than it is. She looked at the door, at the chain, at the bracket, and then at the hinges, and she saw what she had been too fixed on the lock to see. The hinges were on the outside. The flood had thrown the engine on its side, and in doing so had left the cab door hung on hinges she could reach. She did not need to break the lock at all. She needed only to break the pins. The hatchet and the pry bar took the lower hinge in a quarter of an hour. The upper hinge, half seized, took longer, but at last the pin sheared and the whole door sagged sideways, hanging now only by the chained handle, and with a long groan of tortured metal it swung out and down and away, and the dark mouth of the cab stood open to the light for the first time in 11 years. Adeline held very still. A breath of air rose from the opening, cool and dry and old, carrying a smell she could not place at first, dust and iron and something else, something faintly sweet and mineral, like wet stone, like a cellar, like the inside of the earth. She lit the lantern with hands that shook only a little, and she lifted it. And she leaned in through the fallen door and held the light into the dark of the cab. And she was, for a moment, disappointed all over again. There was no gold. There was no chest, no treasure, no glittering hoard, such as a child dreams of finding at the end of a long climb. The cab was small and cramped and tilted, and it held only what a locomotive cab would hold. There was the great cold face of the boiler backhead with its dead gauges and its wheels and levers. There was the firebox door, shut. There was a slat wooden bench where a fireman might have sat. There was a coil of old rotted rope, a rusted oil can, a shovel with its handle gone to splinters. It was the inside of a dead machine, and it held nothing but the tools of its dead work. But Adeline had not climbed down 200 feet and bled her hands to iron to be turned back by a first look, and she remembered the chain, and she held on to the chain as a person holds on to a fact when everything else is telling you to give up. Somebody had sealed this cab. You do not seal an empty room. So she climbed fully inside, bracing her boots against the tilted floor, and she began, carefully, to search. It was the firebox that stopped her. In a working engine, the firebox is a small iron furnace where the coal burns to make the steam, and its door, when she pried it open expecting cold ash, held no ash at all. It had been cleaned out to bare iron and then packed tight and deliberate, with dry grass and rags and folds of waxed canvas, as a person packs a thing meant to be kept dry and safe for a very long time. Adeline's heart began to beat in her throat. She reached in, past the packing, and her fingers closed on something hard and flat and square, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff with age, and she drew it out into the lantern light. It was a strong box, a small one, iron-bound, the size of a large family Bible, and it was heavy, far heavier than its size, heavy as only one thing is ever heavy. And bound to its lid with a strip of rawhide, protected under a second fold of oilcloth so that the desert had not touched it, was a leather folder of papers, and on the outside of that folder, in ink faded to brown, but perfectly, achingly legible, was written a single line in a strong, plain hand. To be opened by an honest person, should God send one down into this place. Adeline read that line 3 times, sitting in the tilted cab with the lantern balanced on the fireman's bench and the strong box heavy in her lap, and she found that she was crying after all, though not from grief this time. She did not fully understand it yet, but she understood that whoever had written those words had died, or as good as died, expecting that no honest person ever would come, and had sealed his hope up anyway, and chained the door on it, and left it to the desert on the chance, the smallest chance, that some day somebody would. She could not open the strong box there. It had a lock of its own, and she had spent her force on the door. But the leather folder was only tied, and she untied it with careful fingers, and inside were papers, a sheaf of them, and she began, in the shaft of noonlight through the fallen door, to read. The first was a letter, and it was long, and it was written in the same strong, plain hand. It began, "I am Josiah Rennick, and if you are reading this, I am dead. And I ask you to bear with a dead man a while, for what I must set down took a long time to happen and will take a little time to say." The name meant nothing to Adeline. But she read on, and the story rose off the paper the way the cool air had risen from the cab, old and dry and waiting. Josiah Rennick had been the surveyor for that same doomed railroad, the Sandoval line out of the east, the company that had brought the locomotive into the Kenyan country in 1876. He had been an honest man in a dishonest venture, and he had known it was dishonest, and the letter was in part a confession. The copper strike the company sold to its eastern investors, he wrote, was a fraud from the beginning. Salted ore and forged assays got up by the company's directors to sell stock they knew was worthless. Rennick had discovered the fraud too late, after the money was raised and the great overland expedition was already grinding through the desert with its oxen and its mules and its single grand locomotive that was meant to prove to the investors that a railroad was truly being built. He had meant to expose it. He had gathered his proofs, the true assays, the forged ones beside them, the letters between the directors that showed they knew. And then the flood had come. He described the flood, and Adeline had to stop reading twice. He wrote of the sky going green at midday, of a sound like a train though there was no track, of the wall of black water that came down Iron Wash and took the mules and the oxen and 3 men whose names he wrote down carefully, one by one, so that someone would know. He himself had been high on the east wall setting a survey stake when it came, and he had lived and he had watched from above as the water drove the locomotive down the canyon and crushed it against the far cliff, and he had climbed down after, in the dark, to the wreck, and he had understood something in that dark that changed the rest of his short life. The directors, he wrote, had not been in the canyon. They were safe in the east, and they would use the flood exactly as they had used the false copper. They would tell the investors a disaster had swallowed the venture. They would collect the insurance on the equipment. They would blame the dead engineer and the dead surveyor, for they meant to list him among the drowned. And they would walk away clean and rich, while the men who had died on their lie lay unburied in the sand. And there was one thing more. Among the directors of the Sandoval and Territorial, a silent partner, the man who had put up the land the ruined venture crossed and stood to gain the water rights along its whole failed route when the company's assets were sold off cheap, was a rancher out of the Ruddock Wells Valley. Adeline's hands had gone cold in the warm cab. she turned the page. He was a younger man then, Rennick wrote, but I knew his name and I know it still, for I heard the director speak it many times, and it was he who first told them where the water ran in this country and how it might be got. And Rennick had written the name plainly in the middle of the page, and Adeline read it, and the canyon seemed to tilt further than it already stood. The name was Halloran, the rancher who had schemed with the Eastern directors to seize the water of the whole valley on the back of a fraudulent railroad in 1876, was the same man whose forged deed now hung her father's stolen spring around her family's neck. It was not a new crime, it was the same crime, grown old and grown bold, an appetite that had waited 11 long years before it simply reached out and took what it had wanted from the start. Everett Halloran had not begun with her father. He had begun with a drowned surveyor and 3 dead men in a canyon nobody climbed into. And Josiah Rennick, dying, alone, with proof in his hands that the world would never let him carry out of that country alive, had done the only thing an honest man could do. He had sealed his proofs in the strong box in the folder, packed them into the one dry iron chamber the flood could not reach, chained the cab shut against the weather and the years, and set his hope adrift in time itself, trusting that a valley which walked its rim and never asked how the engine got there would someday send down someone who would ask, and who would be honest enough to carry the truth back up. He had then, the letter closed, gone to try to walk out of the desert to the territorial marshal with a copy of the proofs on his own body. He had not made it. Adeline would learn later that a man answering his description had been found dead of thirst on the flats 12 miles east, robbed of everything he carried 3 weeks after the flood. The copy he tried to carry out had died with him. Only the sealed one, the one down in the canyon that no one thought to look for, had lived. Adeline sat very still in the cab for a long time. Then she wrapped the folder and the heavy strong box in the oilcloth again, and she put them into her mother's tan leather satchel, and she settled its strap over her shoulder, and she said quietly to the dead man whose hope she now carried, "You sent one. I don't know if I'm honest enough, but I'm the one who came. I'll carry it up." She climbed out of the cab into the light, and that was when she heard it. Not thunder. Voices, men's voices up on the rim, and the blow of horses, and she looked up the long orange throat of the canyon and saw, small and dark against the blue midday sky at the top of the eastern wall, the place where she had come down, 3 riders sitting their horses and peering down into the wash. And she knew, even at that distance, the broad shape of the one in front. It was Sim Doyle. She did not know yet how they had learned. She would piece it together later that old Cletus Barrow, keeping his faithful watch at the rim, had been seen there through a spyglass, that a man does not sit all day at the lip of a worthless canyon for nothing, that the company had riders enough with idle time to wonder why, but she knew, standing on the canyon floor, with the proof of Halloran's whole rotten history slung at her hip, that the riders above her were not there to wish her well. "Miss Corliss," Doyle's voice came down, easy and enormous in the stone throat of the canyon, bouncing off the walls. "You've had yourself quite a morning down there. Mister, Halloran's got a real interest in that old engine all of a sudden. Funny thing, 11 years he never gave it a thought, and this week he can't hardly talk of anything else. Why don't you come up and we'll talk about what you found?" Adeline looked at the eastern wall where the men waited on the only path she knew. Then she looked west and south, down the canyon into the shadowed unknown of Ironwash where she had never been, and she made a choice that would decide everything. She went down the canyon, away from the men, away from the only way up she knew, into the deep and narrow part of Iron Wash, where the walls came so close together in places that she could touch both with her outstretched hands, and where the sky was only a thin blue ribbon far overhead. She did not know if the canyon had another way out. She only knew that the men had horses and held to climb behind her, and that if they had to leave those horses and climb down after her on foot, she would have a start. And a start was all she had ever been given and all she needed. Behind her she heard Doyle curse and heard the men arguing, their voices growing fainter and stranger as the canyon bent, and she pressed on, one hand on the cool sandstone, the satchel heavy against her hip with the weight of the strong box and the truth. The floor of the wash grew damp under her boots. That struck her even in her fear, for Iron Wash was named for its dryness. A canyon that held no water, that grew no grass, worth nothing. And yet the sand grew dark and firm, and then, around a close bend where the walls opened for the first time into a small round chamber of stone, she stopped, because she had found the thing that explained everything, and the last piece of the story fell into her hands like water into cupped palms. In the center of that hidden chamber, set into a flat shelf of pale sandstone, was the mouth of a well. It was a made thing, unmistakably, and old, far older than the railroad, far older than the town. A wide circle of stone had been fitted and dressed by human hands around a dark opening in the canyon floor, and a great round cap of a single carved slab lay half over it, dragged aside long ago so that a crescent of darkness showed at the well's mouth. And out of that dark mouth, cut cleanly into the living rock, ran a channel, a hand-carved water channel, a groove chiseled straight and true into the sandstone floor, descending away down the throat of the deeper canyon with a thin, bright thread of clear water running along its bottom, catching the light where it came down from above. Adeline knelt at the well mouth and looked down into the blackness and heard it, the sound she had not heard anywhere else in all that dry country, the sound of water moving underground, cold and steady and unfailing. And she understood. This was the source. This was the true head of Cold Water Draw, the spring her father had died refusing to sell, the water the whole valley lived on, and it did not begin on the Corliss claim at all. It began here, in the very floor of the worthless canyon that not one soul had ever bothered to walk, welling from the deep rock and running down the ancient carved channel and out under the desert to surface miles away as her father's spring. Whoever held Iron Wash controlled the wellspring itself. Whoever commanded that source commanded the valley more surely than any deed the bank could forge. Everett Halloran had known. Of course he had known. 11 years ago the surveyor Rennick had known, had likely stood at this very well mouth and understood what the flood had jammed a locomotive against. Halloran had spent 11 years, and a forged deed besides, reaching for her father's spring downstream, and all the while the true source had lain here in the canyon he could have simply bought for $3, if only he had known that a Corliss would ever come to own it, if only he had thought a worthless girl with a dead train might be the one to walk down and find the water at the bottom of the world. She heard the men on the rock behind her, closer now, come down into the canyon on foot, their boots scraping, Doyle's voice calling her name with the ease gone out of it. And Adeline Corliss made her second choice, and it was the braver of the two. She did not run further. She had what she needed. She had the proof of the old crime in her satchel and the source of the water under her knees, and she realized with a cold, clear certainty she had the one thing the company could not afford, which was to be seen. A crime done in a canyon 11 years ago, where no one asked and no one climbed, was safe forever. A crime done to a young woman in the open before witnesses in the daylight of the town was another matter entirely. So she waited for them, standing at the well mouth with her chin level and her satchel across her body, and when Sim Doyle came around the bend with his 2 men behind him and his hand near his gun, she was not running, and that stopped him more than any flight would have. "You found the water," Doyle said, looking past her at the well, at the carved channel, at the bright thread running off into the shadow. Something moved across his hard face that might almost have been awe. God Almighty, it's been down here the whole time. It has, Adeline said. 11 years at least. Longer, and Everett Halloran has known where it was the whole time. Hasn't he, Mr. Doyle? That's why he sent you down a canyon he called worthless. That's why a man who never gave this hole a thought can't talk of anything else this week. She watched him. You're not here to talk to me. You're here to take what's in my bag and see that I don't come up. Same as somebody saw that a surveyor didn't come up 11 years back. You want to be that man, Sim Doyle? You want to be the one that did it this time?" Doyle stood a long moment in the cool stone chamber with the sound of the water between them. His 2 men behind him shifted and looked at each other, and Adeline saw that she had guessed right about the one thing that mattered, which was that Sim Doyle did rough work for wages, but he was not, at the bottom of himself, a killer of unarmed women. And he had not fully let himself know until this moment what it was Halloran had sent him to do. He said, "Fetch the bag," Doyle said. Lo, he never said the rest of it out loud. Men like him never do. They let you fill it in. "Then don't fill it in," Adeline said. "Take me up. Take me up in the open, in front of God and the town, and let a court read what's in this bag. If Halloran's got nothing to fear, it costs him nothing. If he's got everything to fear." She let that hang. You'll have carried the truth up out of a canyon instead of burying it in one. I'd think on which of those a man wants his name attached to. It was the longest quiet of Adeline's life. Then Sim Doyle took his hand away from his gun, and he looked once more at that dark carved shaft in the stone, and he said to his men, without turning, "We take her up. In the open. And nobody touches the bag." One of the men began to say something, and Doyle rounded on him with a look that ended it. "You heard me. I've done a deal of things for that man I'd not care to answer for. I'll not add this one. Now help her up the wall." They brought her up out of Ironwash in the middle of the afternoon, and old Cletus Barrow was still at the rim where he had promised to be. And when he saw her come over the edge, alive with 3 of Halloran's men behind her and a satchel still on her shoulder, the old prospector sat down hard in the dirt and wept, and was not ashamed of it. Adeline knelt and took his hand. "You were right," she told him, "about the chain, about all of it. Somebody did send an honest man down there once. He just never got to come up. So we'll do it for him." She stood. "Cletus, I need the whole town. I need them where they can't help but hear. Where does the valley gather?" "Sunday," the old man said, wiping his beard. "Sunday everybody's in town for the market and the mission bell. 2 days." "Then Sunday," Adeline said. Word of what had happened in Ironwash could not be kept quiet, and Everett Halloran, who had spent a lifetime learning that a thing whispered against you is more dangerous than a thing shouted, made the mistake that proud men make. He decided to meet it head on. He let it be known that on Sunday he would answer, before the assembled valley. The wild and grieving fancies of the coreless girl, and put the foolish business to rest, and he came into town that morning in his good black coat with his lawyer beside him, certain that his standing and his money and 11 years of silence would carry him as they always had. The whole valley came. They filled the wide dirt square before the mission. Homesteaders and miners and shopkeepers and the boarding-house women and the ranch hands, the same people who had crossed the rim of Ironwash their whole lives and never asked, the same people who had laughed at a fool girl for signing $3 away on a dead train. Adeline stood on the mission steps in her mother's dress with the tan satchel across her body, and Cletus Barrow stood at her one shoulder, and to the surprise of the entire town, Sim Doyle stood at her other, having decided, it seemed, which name he wanted attached to which thing. Halloran spoke first, smooth and sorrowful, of grief and of a young woman's poor mind unhinged by loss, of wild stories about canyons and old wrecks, and the crowd began, some of them, to nod, for it was an easier thing to believe than the alternative. And then Adeline Corliss opened her mother's satchel and took out a dead man's proof, and she began to read aloud in the clear, carrying voice her father had given her. She read Josiah Rennick's letter. She read the names of the 3 men who had drowned in the flood, slow, one by one, into a square gone utterly silent. She read the account of the salted copper and the forged assays. And then she read the passage that named the silent partner, the valley rancher who had told the Eastern directors where the water ran and how it might be got. And she looked up from the page directly at Everett Halloran, and she read his name aloud to the whole valley, and she watched the smoothness fall off his face like a mask coming loose. "That's a forgery," Halloran said. "Too fast, too loud. Any hand can write a name on a page. That paper proves nothing. It's the ravings of a girl and a scribble of a dead man nobody can question." "Then let me show the town a hand that can be questioned," Adeline said. From the satchel she drew the second paper, the one she had carried down into the canyon for a reason she had not understood until now, the forged deed to her father's water, the one with the T that leaned wrong and the final S that curled up. She held the 2 documents high, side by side, so the men in the front could see. "This is the deed the bank says my father signed away his water on 3 days before the fever took him. And this," she raised the surveyor's folder, "is a letter written 11 years ago in the spring of 1876 that Mr. Halloran says is a forgery got up by me. I ask any honest man here to come and look. The false S on my father's stolen deed and the false S on the paper, Mr. Halloran calls my forgery, are made by the very same hand. I never learned to make that curl. But somebody in this valley has been making that curl for over a decade now, and he made it on both these papers, and he is standing right there in his good black coat." The town came forward to look. They were slow, and they were rough, and not one of them was a scholar. But they had all signed their own names enough times to know a man's hand from a girl's, and they looked, and they looked at Halloran, and the mood of the square turned as weather turns in that country, all at once and with no going back. It was the storekeeper who said it first, loud into the silence, "That's the same hand. God forgive us, that's the same hand on both." Everett Halloran did the thing that men like him always do at the end, the thing the surveyor Rennick had written they would do. He reached for the lie one time too many. He turned to Sim Doyle and said, in front of the whole valley, "Doyle, you were down in that canyon. Tell them she planted it. Tell them the girl put those papers in that wreck herself. You'll be well seen to." And in saying it, in front of everyone, in his certainty that a hired man's silence could always be bought, he told the town in his own voice that there had been men in that canyon, and that he had sent them, and that he expected a false witness for wages, and it was the last thing he ever managed to make the valley believe. Sim Doyle looked at him for a long moment. "No, sir," he said. "The papers were sealed in that firebox under 11 years of rust, packed dry the day of the flood. Weren't no living hand been in there since. I saw it broke open myself. And you never sent me down for papers, Misty Halloran. We both know what you sent me down for. I've decided I'd sooner not carry it. It was over after that, though the courts took some months to make it so. The territorial marshal came and read the surveyor's letter, and the true assays that were still sealed in the little strong box proved the fraud beyond any doubt. Everett Halloran's forged deed to Coldwater Draw was struck down, and with the whole history laid open, the older crimes came with it, and the man who had reached across 11 years to take a valley's water lost everything he had built on the taking of it, lawfully and in the open, before the very people he had ruled by fear. He was undone not by force and not by vengeance, but simply by an honest man's proof finally reaching the daylight, carried into the light of day by the one person contemptible enough, in his eyes, to be sent down after it. The water came back to the Corliss claim, and more than the claim. When the court sorted the truth of it, the head of the spring stood in Iron Wash, on the very canyon parcel that Adeline had bought for $3, while the town laughed, and so the source of the water that the whole northern range depended upon belonged, plainly and by every law the territory kept, to her. She could have done to the valley what Halloran had tried to do. She could have held that source over every homestead and rancher who had pitied her and mocked her and never once asked how a locomotive got into a canyon. Some in the town were afraid, in those first weeks, that she would. She did not. She rode out to Iron Wash with old Cletus Barrow and a wagon and a stonemason from the mission. And she had them clear the drift and dress the old carved channel and mend the ancient well cap, and she had it written into the county record in Alonzo Speck's careful clerk's hand that the water of Iron Wash was pledged to the land and to no one man, exactly as her father had sworn in the street years before that he would never sell it. Exactly as some far older hand than her father's had meant it when they first cut that channel into the living rock. The spring would run for the valley. It would run for the homesteaders who had laughed and the ones who had not, without distinction, as water is meant to run. Your father said the same thing, Cletus told her, standing beside the old spring in the bright canyon daylight while the mason worked. The exact same. That the spring was promised to no one but the land. He was fighting for this his whole life, and he never knew the head of it was down here. He'd have liked knowing you found it. He'd have liked knowing you gave it back as he'd have given it himself. He didn't leave me nothing, Adeline said quietly, looking down into the dark water. That's what they all said. Left her nothing but a dead train in a ditch. But he left me the one thing they couldn't forge his name onto, because they never thought it was worth anything. He left me the water. He just left it a long way down. She kept the canyon. She built, over the next year, a small stone house on the shelf above the well mouth, out of the pale dressed sandstone, with the great red walls rising on either side, and the deep blue desert sky above, and the sound of the water always moving somewhere under the floor, and she lived there, and the valley, which had paced the rim of that place for 11 years and never gone down, began to come down to her. They came for water in the dry months, and she gave it. They came to see the old locomotive, which she left exactly where the flood had jammed it, rusted and enormous against the west wall. A monument now not to a fool's dream, but to the honest man who had died sealing the truth into its cold iron heart. She put a plain marker at the head of the trail with the 3 drowned men's names on it, and Josiah Rennick's below them, so that no one who came down into Iron Wash would ever again fail to ask how the engine got there, or who it was that had waited 11 years in the dark to be found by someone honest at last. And on the quiet evenings, when the canyon filled with the long, warm light and the sandstone glowed like a banked fire, Adeline Corliss would sometimes sit on the shelf by the well with her mother's tanned satchel beside her, empty now of its terrible cargo, holding nothing but bread and a canteen as an ordinary satchel is meant to, and she would think about a dead man's careful hand, and about the words he had written in the hope that no one would ever read them, and the deeper hope that someone would. To be opened by an honest person should God send one down into this place. She had not felt honest that morning she climbed down. She had felt beaten and small and half a fool. But she had gone down anyway when the whole valley stayed on the rim, and that, she had come to understand, was the only honesty the words had ever asked for. Not to be certain, only to climb down and look when everyone else was content to walk past. That is the whole of it. The story of the woman they laughed at for buying a rusted locomotive buried in a canyon for $3, and of what was sealed in the cab, and of how it took back every acre and every drop and every kind word that had been stolen from her family, and gave most of it away again to the valley that had wronged her. Because that was the kind of taking back her father would have understood. If you have stayed with Adeline all the long climb down into that canyon and all the long climb back up into the light, then we would be honored if you would leave a like before you go, and tell us down in the comments what part of her story stayed with you the most, whether it was the chain on the cab, or the water running in the dark, or a dead man's hope carried up at last into the daylight. And if a quiet hour with a forgotten corner of the frontier is how you like to unwind of an evening, be sure to subscribe so we can send you the next tale the desert has been keeping, and the next young woman with nothing left to lose, who finally goes down to see what everyone else was afraid to. Until then, from all of us here at the Canyon Inheritance, thank you for listening, and rest easy. The lamp is lit, and the water is running, and every honest person who ever climbs down into the dark will find, in the end, that it was always meant for them.